get it. It's hot. It's gonna get a whole lot hotter.
No, please, please. We are talking R.I.P.D 2, Rise of the Damned. And this is directed and co-written by Paul Leyden. And this one stars Jeffrey Donovan, who you may know from Burn Notice as our main character, Roy. You've also got supporting kind of cast members here, Penelope Mitchell and Richard Brake. Brake, of course, playing a bad guy, as he normally does. And this is obviously a prequel, though it is marketed as a sequel, but it is in fact a prequel to the Ryan Reynolds movie, which is of course based on a comic book. Now, if you're not familiar with the title, it's kind of Men in Black, the supernatural version, is the easiest way to kind of talk about this. So, the Ryan Reynolds movie was one of Reynolds' lesser movies to a certain degree, both critically and financially. And we have seen this kind of trend of making kind of belated sequels of previous movies, and these sequels are to kind of lower budget, kind of straight to VOD, DVD kind of style things. That's obviously what the case is here. It's a lower budget movie with kind of lesser known kind of actors and things like this. What can I say that works in this movie's favour? But before that, I will just go through the plot. Essentially, we have Roy, played by Jeffrey Donovan, is a lawman who is killed in the line of duty, and because he's a virtuous soul, he is recruited by the R.I.P.D, which is essentially kind of like heaven's police force, so to speak. And he is sent back down to Earth to deal with a demon who is trying to bring about hell on Earth, and he is partnered with a sassy female warrior woman who may well be a famous figure from history, and together they must kind of try and thwart this demon's evil plans. Let's talk about it. Okay, what do I think that works in this movie? Now, this movie is, I think, aimed at a family audience. When you're going to watch this, it has a very kind of light tone. The jokes are very broad. The kind of the sensibilities are more family orientated. There's less of kind of sort of, you know, rude jokes and things like this. It tends to be quite kind of family orientated. So it's obviously, I think, aimed at a younger audience, not necessarily people at my age group. But I do find that this movie did have some heart behind it. There's actually a few sequences here where I actually felt it kind of pulled at the old heartstrings and did actually give me somewhat of the feels. And so that was quite impressive, to be honest with you, because I have to be honest with you, I wasn't particularly invested in the majority of the story, but there were times here where I felt did a good job of eliciting a kind of emotional response. Certainly because the way this kind of mythology is set up, the people from the R.I.P.D can't communicate with loved ones back on Earth and things like this, which leads to some, you know, somewhat kind of emotive kind of scenes, which I thought were quite well handled, and I kind of quite like that. Now it's kind of done in very broad strokes, but I still felt it was kind of done well enough where it kind of, as I say, it made me have the feels to a certain degree. So that was all good. I think the bad guys here, particularly kind of Richard Brake and his kind of like female second in command, were quite fun. They're not on screen loads, to be honest with you, but Richard Brake is kind of so daft at playing a kind of a bad guy these days. He does it in his sleep, but he's quite good in it. And the one thing I will say as well, which I was quite impressed with here, was the VFX. Now, obviously, this is a lower budget movie. So sometimes these can kind of suffer with the VFX, and although it's obviously CGI effects here, it was still quite impressive. I have to say, I think the VFX and these kind of like smoky kind of demon kind of creatures were quite impressive in both design and their kind of execution. I kind of quite like the kind of the way they were depicted and things like that. I mean, the story itself and their motivations are quite, you know, kind of quite broad, as I say, but the visual representations of them, I thought were kind of quite good. The movie's kind of reasonably action-packed, and I think if you're kind of on a younger audience here, and you kind of like just broad humour, let me just put it like this, then you kind of may well enjoy some of the kind of the lighter kind of quite jokey moments and stuff like that. And I do feel the movie does a reasonable job here of exploring the kind of the characters, giving you a kind of a good idea to their kind of their individual characteristics and kind of, you know, what makes them tick. Again, you know, it's done in a very kind of like surface level and a very kind of like basic kind of and I'm going to say it a broad kind of way, but no, I do feel it was effective at least in kind of giving you a somewhat of an idea of these kind of characters, albeit they're not really portrayed to be real kind of people. They're kind of more sort of, well, comic book characters to a certain degree, and that's kind of what they kind of feel like. The Old West setting was interesting, although it certainly doesn't feel like a genuine kind of like Old West environment here. But nonetheless, it was kind of quite fun to have this kind of like a, you know, an Old West kind of supernatural kind of showdown, which gives it kind of a, you know, a bit more of a flavour kind of to it. What doesn't work in this movie? Okay, let's kind of the movie I think skews a little young. From watching this movie, and obviously if you even compare it to the original, which I still felt had that kind of that Ryan Reynolds-esque kind of appeal to it, which I do think appeals to both young and older. That lacks in this movie. This movie definitely just aims at a kind of, or at least even if it's unintentional, I feel it is best placed for a younger audience because it's so broad. I mean, the characters, although you can kind of get a good sense of what they're supposed to be, they don't really feel like kind of real people in any kind of sense. They feel like, you know, characters that someone has kind of written and that sort of thing. They don't ever really feel like kind of the actual kind of people. The kind of the Old West here is depicted in a very kind of like family friendly kind of way. One of the kind of the elements that they introduce is that these two R.I.P.D agents, everyone kind of sees them as not their kind of real selves. So the Joe public on the ground see them as these two black women, and bear in mind we're talking about the kind of the 1800s here, and it's kind of introduced where there's a little bit of kind of racism and things like that, but it's really, you know, it's quite gentle with it in a way. And obviously, you know, had it been a more of a realistic idea and these things introduced and kind of commented on, it certainly wouldn't have been quite as kind of like fluffy as this movie kind of depicts, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of the things here are just kind of very kind of like safe, sanitized kind of TV, that no one's ever really kind of dirty. Everyone here is just kind of like, you know, caricatures, the kind of like the corrupt mayor, he's kind of like still a little bit of a doofus and things like this. It's all very kind of broad strokes. The humour is very kind of like younger skewing, as I've said. So, and I don't think it does enough to kind of like cross over to attract kind of like older audiences who I think will be put off by the kind of the younger kind of humour and tone that this movie exhibits. And I even know the younger audiences, will they really care about this? There's no kind of kid characters. I don't know if this audience I feel it's made for would actually been that interested. Are they really that interested? Are kids interested in the Old West these days? There's no kind of like child characters for them to kind of latch onto. I don't know. I think the movie is a little bit misjudged in regards to its kind of tone. Now the acting is kind of, again, it's very much like cartoon characters. Now this was possibly the way that these, because it's kind of everyone. So I would have said this is probably the way this movie was directed and written rather than the actor's fault. Because I have seen, for example, Jeffrey Donovan do an alright performance, but here he's very kind of like, just kind of like a cartoon character, a caricature. And as it comes, the acting seems very kind of like, just again, I'm going to use that word, broad. But I don't know if it's particularly kind of engaging. I think this movie should have, in my opinion, just kind of matured it slightly, I think, to kind of maybe have a little bit more of a cross appeal, in my opinion. There's some very obvious kind of like plot points that will kind of happen in the movie. It doesn't really, it's not a particularly kind of complex script, and again, that's going to kind of play into the kind of the younger nature of this movie. It's, you can pretty much guess where it's kind of going. I never really felt like the action sequences were all that kind of breathtaking. there's plenty of kind of fight scenes, but a lot of it is kind of just kind of like, you know, faceless goons and things like that, and the choreography was passable, but it wasn't anything particularly kind of entertaining. Our final fight, I felt, was a little bit kind of underwhelming. It kind of is over pretty quickly, and I was expecting a little more from it. And I never really got a sense of genuine kind of danger or any kind of thing like that. I have to say this movie is kind of like, I think it's probably okay for a very small amount of people, and other people will find it just a little bit kind of too kiddie, a little bit kind of too like silly and kind of goofy for taste. So at least that's how I you know, approach it. But it's a reasonably well put together movie. It does feel like it has a reasonable amount of production value for what is clearly a kind of a lower budget movie. So I did kind of appreciate that. And there are moments here where I do feel it actually manages to kind of like be somewhat kind of like a little bit emotive, which was good. So I have to say, although I don't think this is a particularly kind of memorable movie, it's not terrible. You know, it's certainly, I think, watchable for some people, but I don't think it really ever goes past a 4 out of 10 for me, which might seem harsh, but I do think it's a slightly below average movie, to be honest with you. But it's kind of close to it, at least. 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.